Nobody considered it suspicious when 52-year-old Edward Thornton brought home an old freezer with a spoiled door. But 2 days after this freezer was made available at their residence in Oakville, Illinois, 3 heartbreaking contents would be found stored inside the freezer. However, the intention would not be to preserve these 3 contents, but rather to fulfill a very wicked promise that a lot of people considered a joke. On January 4, 2022, Mrs. Margaret Thornton was preparing to go to the farmer's market where she normally sells produce. However, before she embarked on the journey, she had to put things in order at home. Margaret instructed her first daughter, Emily, to wash all her siblings' clothes after they had finished eating, which the 11-year-old not only agreed to do but immediately began bringing out the dirty clothes for washing. Margaret also made sure that the food at home would be enough for her husband and her 3 children before proceeding to make what seemed like an ordinary decision. Margaret left her 3 daughters, Emily, Sophia, and little Grace, under the care of their father, her husband Edward Thornton. She packed up her things and then left for the market together with her only son Michael. When Margaret returned from the market in the evening, she noticed something very unusual. After she opened the gates, none of her children came out to welcome her. This was quite unusual because normally whenever she returned from the market and then opened the gate to the house, her children always ran out to welcome her. However, this time around there was only silence. Margaret walked into the house and then found their father seated calmly on the porch while mending his trousers as if all was well. This got her confused, and she decided to find out where the children went. Margaret asked her husband about the 3 kids, but his response was very cold. He simply told her that he didn't know. His response was very concerning because Margaret had left the 3 children under his care before leaving home that morning. She was alarmed and then began searching for them. She checked everywhere, including the places they normally visited and even the places they didn't. But sadly, there was no sign of her daughters anywhere. Meanwhile, Edward remained unbothered by the possibility of his 3 children missing. He continued stitching his trousers as if nothing had happened. When Margaret returned to the house from the search, she asked him once again, but instead of showing concern, Edward shouted at her. At that time, he had already finished mending his trousers and had even worn them, but still he made no effort to join the search. Margaret asked why he didn't seem bothered about their missing children even though it was already getting late in the evening. Edward told her that he didn't know where to look for them, but Margaret insisted that he did. That was when Edward said something strange that set the tone for the horrific discovery awaiting her within the house. Edward asked his wife if it was possible for him to have sold the children. Margaret, knowing her husband very well, replied yes, that he was capable of selling them. Margaret tried to remain calm. She went inside the kitchen to bring out the food Emily had prepared earlier. She then sat on the porch where her husband was also sitting and called her elder sister to inform her of what was going on. Her sister told her that since her husband was not bothered about the children's whereabouts, then he must know where they were. At this time it was already dark, and Margaret was just about to eat the food her daughter had previously prepared for her. That was when Edward stood up and walked to a small deep freezer on the porch. He opened it and said, "Come and see where the children you are looking for are playing." Margaret rushed to the freezer, and what she saw would haunt her forever. Her 3 daughters, Emily, Sophia, and Grace, were squeezed inside the freezer with Emily, the eldest, lying on top of the others. The 3 kids had black liquid coming out of their mouths. Edward began pulling out the unresponsive bodies one after the other, while Margaret tried to revive them, hoping against hope that they were still breathing, but it was already too late. Margaret raised an alarm, and the neighbors came rushing in. A car was quickly arranged to take the children to the hospital. But by the time they got there, the doctors confirmed what Margaret feared the most. Her 3 daughters were dead. Then came another disturbing revelation. The doctor noticed a strange chemical smell on both the children and their father. When asked about the smell, Edward claimed he used a chemical to treat the water in their well. But to Margaret, it all made sense. She suspected that her husband had poisoned the children. Her brother immediately reported the matter to the police. The police rushed to the scene, questioned Edward, and eventually arrested him. When Margaret was asked who she suspected, she didn't hesitate. She told them she suspected her husband. According to her, Edward had brought the freezer home to sell just 2 days before the horrific discovery was made. On the day he brought home the freezer, Margaret asked him if the buyer couldn't have bought it from where it was instead of bringing it home to occupy space. But Edward didn't give a reasonable response to her question. She also believed that at the time the children were put in the freezer, they were no longer alive. Her reason was that the freezer had no lock and was also not closing well. So if the children had been alive when placed inside, they could have easily opened the freezer to come out, but they didn't. Margaret recalled that her husband had threatened her multiple times in the past. He said he would kill her and the children and that none of her relatives could do anything because they were poor. He even boasted that he would never go to jail because he had powerful connections who would set him free. Edward once told her chillingly that he would leave her empty-handed, and that one day both of them would make it to the front pages of newspapers, and that their entire neighborhood would also gather because of them. She said she had reported these threats to Edward's elder sister and her own family, but they all dismissed them. Edward's sister claimed he was joking, and when Margaret's family confronted Edward, he would simply say he was correcting her and that Margaret was stubborn. She said it got to a point that Edward asked her to leave his house. But after packing her bags, she told him that she would also like to go with her children, to which Edward refused. He locked the gates, preventing her from leaving, and that was how she stayed back. When asked what Edward did for a living, Margaret said he had returned from overseas about 2 years earlier, and ever since then, he had become distant and aggressive. He didn't contribute to food or school fees. In fact, in January the previous year, he seized the house and gate keys, leaving the family locked out most times. The children would sometimes stay outside after school, waiting for him to come back so that they could enter the house. Margaret admitted that even though she doubted and also feared his threats, both families convinced her that he wasn't capable of harm. But now her 3 daughters were gone. Margaret had been married to Edward for over 8 years. She was originally from Ohio while Edward was from Illinois. Both of them relocated to Oakville, Illinois, where Edward built his house and Margaret engaged in her produce business. Margaret already had a daughter before getting married to Edward. After their marriage, the union was blessed with 3 more children. According to reports, Edward was never troublesome. But ever since he returned from overseas 2 years earlier, he had become a completely different person. A neighbor who seemed to know the couple very well said Edward once complained to him that his wife was cheating on him because he had no money. According to the neighbor, he advised Edward to take solace in the beautiful children, and that very soon he would begin to enjoy the fruits of his labor. However, he never imagined that things would ever get to the point they found themselves. Margaret insisted her husband was not poor, not frustrated, and not mentally unstable. According to her, he came back from overseas with a lot of money, but he simply chose to spend it on himself. The police wanted to carry out an autopsy but asked Margaret to pay $5,000, which she couldn't afford. Edward was remanded in prison, and at the time of writing this account, there was no update on whether he was charged in court and eventually convicted for murder or not. This was a truly tragic case that shocked the entire Oakville community and beyond. It serves as a stark reminder of how seriously we should take threats of violence, even when they appear to be jokes. The deaths of Emily, Sophia, and little Grace might have been prevented if the warnings and red flags had been heeded earlier. Thank you for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you and see you in the next one.